Welcome to the Norwegian Atlantic Committee and an installment in the Transatlantic Seminars series. Today we will be discussing one of the great issues of today. We will be discussing the future of NATO, the purpose of American power, and security politics after Afghanistan. And with me here today, I have two of the truly great minds of contemporary political science. We have Professor John J. Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago and Jonathan Wertheim from the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And the title for today's seminar is The Return of Great Power Politics, America in the 21st Century. It has been a difficult decade for the West. And before handing over the mic to my two speakers here today, I'd like to point out some of the things that have happened in recent times. Perhaps the most troubling development we have seen is a rapid fall in democracy around the world. According to the Economist Democracy Index, only 8.3% of the world's population are today living in full-fledged democracies. The West's way of governance is under pressure. At the same time, we see a series of rifts within the alliance, most recently put on display over the AUKUS submarine deal between France, the United States, and the United States. Who can remember or who could forget the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021? We are only 2 years away now from the year when NATO members were all supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, with few signs that even the majority of the member states will do so. And at the same time, United States politics has been, well, difficult to understand for those of us looking from abroad. The storming of the Capitol building seems to herald a dissolvement or dissolution of the agreement between the two main parties regarding the purpose of American power. We find ourselves in early February 2022, and I would like to invite you, Professor John Mearsheimer, to give some introductory remarks on the grand topic for today.
It's a great pleasure to be here today and talking about this important subject. What I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about American grand strategy today at a very general level. And then I'd like to talk about specifically how it applies to Europe. Now, let me start by talking about some of the key features of the wider world that the United States operates in. And here I think there are 2 points of great importance that I would like to emphasize. The first point is that we today operate in a multipolar world. We have left behind the unipolar world. When I was born in December of 1947, the United States operated in a bipolar world. There were 2 great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Then when the Cold War ended, we went from bipolarity to unipolarity. The United States was by far the most powerful state on the planet, and that unipolar world existed from roughly 1990 to 2017. In about 2017, we were clearly moving out of unipolarity into multipolarity. And it's very important when you think about American grand strategy today to understand that it was very different from American grand strategy in the unipolar world. Almost everybody in the audience grew up in the unipolar world. You want to understand that world is gone. We're now in a multipolar world, and the United States is going to behave differently in that multipolar world than it did in the unipolar world. And in that multipolar world, there are three great powers, obviously, the United States, China, and Russia. And of those three great powers, the United States is by far the most powerful, and China is, at this point in time, a peer competitor of the United States. Russia, on the other hand, is the weakest of those three great powers. But nevertheless, those three great powers comprise the multipolar system that we're now in, that is very different from the unipolar system that you all knew for many years. Now, the second point I want to make about the strategic environment, the broader strategic environment, is that over the course of American history, Europe has been the most important area of the world for the United States. Even though the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, Europe was the most important theater of the war from December 7, 1941, until the war was concluded in August 1945. Europe mattered more than Asia did. When I was young, during the Cold War, we used to say there were three areas of the world outside of the United States that were worth fighting and dying for. One, and most importantly, was Europe. Two was Northeast Asia. And number three was the Persian Gulf. Well, for the first time in American history, Europe is no longer the most important area of the world for the United States. Indeed, East Asia is today the most important area of the world because, of course, that's where China is located. The Persian Gulf is the second most important area of the world for the United States because that's where oil is, and the Chinese are deeply interested in the Persian Gulf because they get roughly 25% of their oil from the Gulf. So East Asia is number one, the Persian Gulf is number two, and Europe, which again has historically been the most important area for the United States, is the third most important area. And it is a distant third. And it's a distant third because there is no peer competitor in Europe. Russia is surely a great power, as I emphasized before, but it is not China. It is not a peer competitor. So what you see is, first of all, we've moved from unipolarity to multipolarity, which has great consequences. And second, we've moved into a world where Europe is no longer the most important area of the world for the United States for strategic reasons. Indeed, it is the third most important. Now, let me talk a little bit about what's going on in Europe today with regard to the United States. One might think that given the Ukraine crisis and given America's involvement in that crisis, which of course involves Russia, that what I said is really not true. After all, it appears that Europe is very important. I think that's not the case. I think it's very important to understand that the Ukraine crisis is a vestige of the unipolar moment. What exactly do I mean by that? During the unipolar moment, the United States pursued a policy of liberal hegemony. The United States decided, when the Cold War ended, that it was going to turn Europe into a giant zone of peace. It was going to extend liberal institutions, liberal values, liberal political systems eastward. And NATO expansion was, of course, at the heart of that effort to create a zone of peace in Eastern Europe. And in 1999, you had the first tranche of states, new states, come into NATO, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Then in 2004, you had another tranche of East European states come into NATO. But then in 2008, it was actually April 2008 at the Bucharest summit, NATO made a fundamental mistake. It declared at the end of that NATO summit that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of the alliance. The Russians made it unequivocally clear at that point in time that that was not going to happen. They drew a red line in the sand. They said that Ukraine and Georgia are not becoming part of NATO. And as you all know, in August of 2008, no accident, you had a war over Georgia. And in February of 2014, a major crisis broke out over Ukraine, which eventuated in a war between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia taking the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. That crisis continues to this day, and indeed it is heated up in recent times. So the point that I'm trying to convey to you here is that this is not a new crisis. This is an old crisis that is a vestige of the foolish policies that the United States and its West European allies pursued during the Cold War. Now, I want to make it clear that this crisis is a disastrous crisis. It's a disastrous crisis for a lot of reasons. First of all, there's no solution to it. NATO is deeply committed to bringing Ukraine into the alliance, and the Russians are deeply committed to preventing that from happening. And how you satisfy both sides with regard to that issue is hard to understand. I can't fathom how we do it. So I don't see a solution to it. Furthermore, it's a disaster from an American point of view because Russia's not a threat to the United States. It's just not a serious threat. The United States does face one serious threat. It has a peer competitor in China, not Russia. So we should not be fooling around dealing with Russia when we have this threat in East Asia. This brings me to my final 2 points, which cannot be emphasized enough. Because we are focusing so much attention on Russia, unnecessary attention on Russia, we are unable to fully pivot to East Asia to deal with the China threat. This is disastrous. And furthermore, we are in effect driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This is a violation of Realism 101. If you're in a world where there are three great powers, and one of those great powers is an existential threat to you, and that's how we view China, then you want the Russians on your side of the ledger. You don't want the Russians to be allied with China. But what the United States is foolishly doing is pushing the Chinese into the arms, pushing the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, and at the same time making it difficult for the United States to pivot out of Europe and pivot to East Asia, where our security interests are greatest. So all of this is to say that what is happening in Europe today, especially with regard to Ukraine, is bad news for U.S. grand strategy. In fact, the United States should be pulling its forces out of Europe and focusing on East Asia, not making a bad situation with Ukraine worse. Thank you.
We have been discussing these issues for some years now, since I first reached out to you as a young fledgling PhD student. And I think your argument comes across succinctly and easy to understand. The game has changed. The polarity of the international system has changed. And it's only to be expected that the world should be played differently. We also have with us Stephen Wertheim, who I have been admiring and following for a great many years, ever since he was a PhD student. He has written a best-selling book called And Tomorrow the World. And Stephen, if you will, could you give us some your perspectives on the grand topic of great power politics and America in the 21st century.
Well, thank you. It's truly an honor for me to speak to the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, and I'm grateful to you, Asle, for the invitation, and also delighted to be in dialogue with John, from whom I have learned an enormous amount, and no doubt will learn even more over the course of our discussion today. So let me get right to the standoff that Russia has initiated with the West. The likely outcome of the crisis, as I see it, will be a more militarized Eastern Europe and a hardened division between Russia and the West economically and otherwise. If Russia launches a new military offensive against Ukraine, the requirements for security in Eastern Europe will rise, and the Biden administration has already indicated a willingness to do more to meet those requirements through new rotational deployments. Even if Russia were to de-escalate in Ukraine, a similar outcome could still occur. The Eastern members of NATO could seek reinforcement, and the United States could well provide it. Now, the main argument I want to make today is that the likely outcome of the crisis, a more intensive U.S. security commitment in Europe, would be an extremely negative development for American grand strategy. It would be so negative that we should have serious doubts about whether a U.S.-led NATO alliance could be sustained over the medium to long term. And that should make us want to look now for a different European security architecture that could be more durable and effective. Now, I believe this is so for three reasons. First, for the United States, the costs and risks of acting as Europe's leading security provider would only increase in the face of a resurgent Russia that had just committed, or at least threatened, a spectacular act of territorial aggression against such a significant country as Ukraine, with a population of 44 million people. This would thrust the United States into a new position in Europe. After the Cold War, the United States took the lead in European security affairs, in part because the costs and risks of doing so were low, at least for the foreseeable future, and the foreseeable future tends to be all that concerns politicians. Now we're about to enter a new phase in which the United States will face a greater chance that its security commitments in Eastern Europe will come due. And this after American presidents have spent the last decade urging European allies to share the burden of European defense. The U.S. Army might be happy to receive a new mission to succeed its nation-building efforts in the greater Middle East, but most everyone else in Washington will see America's overall strategic challenge get worse, as John has said. Indeed, the second problem is that the United States would face increased demands in Europe precisely as it is attempting to shift its priority to Asia. Almost as soon as the phrase great power competition came out of the Pentagon in 2018, a clearer consensus formed that China constitutes a much more significant competitor than Russia does. Today, the way to demand resources in DC is to attach it to the China threat. And right now we see that effort taking crude form in prominent warnings that if Russia is permitted to further invade Ukraine, China will be emboldened to move on Taiwan. In my view, the two situations, in fact, have little connection. But the specter of simultaneous conflicts speaks to an appropriate concern. Can the United States really be prepared to wage two wars against two great powers, China and Russia? It's now clear which one the United States would prioritize if push came to shove. Third, there's another competitor for resources besides Asia and Europe, and that is the American public. We simply don't know what will happen if and when an external event caused the American people and their representatives to believe that U.S. foreign policy is crowding out domestic investments, or what would happen if the United States confronted the actual prospect of fighting a great power war in either Europe or Asia. Now, one might be forgiven for thinking that we've seen 8 decades worth of evidence that the United States is highly committed to exercising global leadership through military superiority. And that's true. But it was in particular international contexts that the United States developed a political consensus around global leadership. First, in World War II and the Cold War, the United States abandoned its tradition of non-entanglement because American leaders perceived an unprecedented threat from the Axis alliance and then from Soviet-backed communism. They wanted to stop totalitarian powers from conquering their way to dominance across Eurasia. That is, the threat involved the physical control of vast and productive regions, and control not just by authoritarian, but also by totalitarian regimes, which by controlling those regions would effectively close them off to liberal American-style interaction and influence, hence the problem to the United States. Then, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States embraced global dominance for just the opposite reason, in a sense. The stakes were so low, the threats so minor, that perhaps the United States could keep things that way through only modest exertion. In the 1990s, there were no more rival great powers, let alone totalitarian ones, and far from anticipating that new ones would arise, American policymakers hoped that China and Russia would become liberal democracies as they grew. But that didn't happen, and now we are entering an era of great power rivalry in which the external environment lies somewhere in the middle of the other two eras of US global leadership. No longer are threats minuscule and costs low. To the contrary, the United States could find itself risking war with other great powers near those countries' borders and over issues of questionable intrinsic importance to American security and prosperity. But if the unipolar moment is no more, neither are we quite back to facing 20th century conditions of totalitarian mass conquests. China is the world's largest trading country, far from pursuing a closed, autarkic model. Russia lacks the capability to conquer much of Europe, assuming it had good reason to try. China has greater capability, but has yet to try to conquer other countries with which it can do business anyway. Meanwhile, climate change looms as perhaps a greater threat to the American people where they live and work than the conventional military threats from China or any other nation state. And there's no way to address the climate crisis without China, which is both the #1 carbon emitter and a leading producer of solar and other renewables. And that's why I think we are moving into rather uncharted waters for US grand strategy. The United States faces significant costs and risks in order to address not terribly high threats to its underlying interests. In other words, does the price of primacy now outweigh the benefits? Expect this question to be posed more and more if and as American resources become strained and trade-offs return to the country's domestic politics. Now, in the face of Russia's threats right now, is there no alternative but for the United States to redouble its investment in European security, even at the risk of longer-term strategic insolvency? Perhaps there is an alternative. The prospect of an increasing American commitment to Europe ought to be so undesirable as to make Washington and European capitals undertake a very serious effort to reach a diplomatic solution to the current standoff. To have a chance of success, such an effort may require effectively ruling out the further enlargement of NATO. Even more difficult, perhaps, it may mean pressuring the government of Ukraine to implement the most painful provisions of the Minsk II protocol to deal with the separatist conflict in the East. But if, and it's a big if, Russia were then to de-escalate and take a diplomatic path, then the United States and Europe would gain an opportunity to recast Europe's security architecture before spiraling events define it for them. Such an effort would have to redress three problems with the post-Cold War security system. The United States has too great a role, the European allies have too little, and Russia is left on the margins. To solve these problems, Europe would have to find its way to assume significantly greater responsibility for its defense, whether that happens within NATO, through the European Union or through less formal groupings. And Russia, which has grown ever more hostile to the mechanisms of European security, should gradually become a part of them. As part of this process, NATO would move from an era of enlargement to one of consolidation. If its open door remained formally open, NATO would nevertheless place a heavy chair in the doorway, the message being better not to walk through. Now, what I've just described is only what I think should happen, or more precisely, what officials in the United States should want and try to make happen in order to improve America's grand strategy. But I am not optimistic that what I think should happen will happen. That's not only for the obvious reasons that Russia could act as a spoiler and a Europe-led European defense is a tall task, it's also because the United States, by pursuing global dominance for decades, has helped to generate its own obstacles to making strategic adjustments in its interests. Even if Russia were to de-escalate in Ukraine, it would take strong leadership from President Biden and political capital to show to Congress that walking further down a diplomatic path with Russia does not constitute weakness or surrender. In any case, it's not clear that the Biden administration would even want to change the European security architecture along the lines I've described. Yes, the administration has encouraged a stronger European defense, but only as a complement to a US-led NATO. Yes, the administration is currently pursuing serious negotiations with Russia, but it has so far stood by the abstract principle that countries have a right to choose which alliances they wish to join, even though that principle is an empty one with respect to Ukraine, which NATO does not wish to admit, regardless of its wishes to join. Likewise, the administration initially sought what it called a stable and predictable relationship with Russia, but it did not match its rhetoric with substance that could address festering Russian grievances. So for more than a decade, American presidents, both Democrat and Republican, have tried to make strategic adjustments, namely to do more to counterbalance China in Asia, to carry less of the load in Europe, and to disentangle from the politics and wars of the Middle East. Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden have those goals in common, but they also share so far a basic commonality in results. In the end, they've made important but largely marginal adjustments in the scheme of things. The United States remains committed to global dominance, to being the preeminent military power in all three critical regions, as well as the Western Hemisphere. Inertia is prevailing. But I wonder, and America's allies should wonder, how long inertia can last, especially when the forces resisting it appear only to be mounting. So I will leave my opening remarks there. Thank you very much, and over to you, Asle. Thank you very much, and over to you, Asle.
Thank you so much. This was very, very interesting. It's interesting to see that Professor Mearsheimer, being a pioneer of one of the great American intellectual traditions, that being realism and being synonymous with the tradition of offensive realism, and also Dr. Wertheim, who is an historian and comes out of what I see as the liberal historical tradition in the United States, see very many of the same solutions and answers to the current query. America should focus on number one. America should focus on the real threat, i.e. China, and that Russia is an issue that should be resolved with other means than those military, for the reason that the United States should avoid being distracted in its main endeavor. At the same time, there seems to be a little bit of a discrepancy between our two speakers, with Dr. Wertheim arguing that, at least in his book, that an overly muscular and militarily led foreign policy creates unnecessarily much blowback towards American interests, and Professor Mearsheimer, who argues that America needs to negotiate and to deal with China from a position of strength, and diverting its resources to Ukraine is only weakening the America's hand. But there are issues here that I think is more troubling. To those of you who have studied political science will know or be intimately aware of one of the books that helped constitute our study of research. It's called The 20 Years Crisis by Edward Hallett Carr. And he points to the most perilous moments in international politics occurring at exactly the moment that Dr. Wertheimer outlined, the moment when the hegemon finds that the price of primacy is becoming more expensive than the perceived benefits of being the primary power. This, according to Carr, will lead the leading power to shrink from its responsibilities, which leads us to the problem of Russia. Because I think most will agree with what you have both said about the position and role of Russia in contemporary foreign politics. It's solely determined on the strength of arms. The Russian economy is not big enough to support really the ambition by white knuckles to a great power position that their resources don't truly warrant. The great political scientists from Scandinavia, the man who coined the term geopolitics, Rudolf Kjellén, argues in his 4-volume book affairs is not the rising powers that we spend so much time discussing, but it's the defunct powers, as he calls them, powers such as Russia, that is desperately seeking to maintain a position in the world that their resources no longer justify. According to Kjellén, these are the countries that provoke stupid wars, that drag the other powers in. And I would like to cut straight to the issue at hand here, which I think many of the people viewing are wondering. What is Russia trying to get out of this? Because their actions is quite clearly in contradiction with the UN covenant, and it's very difficult to see how NATO could, even if NATO would be so dispersed, could issue this sort of declarations and promises that Russia is looking for. I don't think they will have them. And therefore, what is Russia trying to get out of this? Are they trying to see whether the Biden administration is weak, to see maybe that they can get something out of this? Just rattle the cage and see what falls out? Is that what they're looking for? Professor Mearsheimer, please.
I think this is a very simple issue. What the Russians want is they want the United States to say in writing that Ukraine will not become part of NATO. They've made that perfectly clear for a long time now. I think you, Asle, refuse to believe that NATO expansion is the source of the problem here. You believe that the Russians are the principal source of the problem. This is aggressive behavior on the part of Russia. The Russians are being unreasonable, and it's poor little NATO and the poor little United States that has to figure out some way to deal with this highly aggressive Russian bear. That is not my interpretation of what's going on, and I think all the evidence supports my point of view. The Russians have made it clear, as I said in my formal presentation, since April 2008, that Ukraine is not going to become part of NATO. They view that as an existential threat, just like the United States has a Monroe Doctrine, which says that no distant great power can put military forces in the Western Hemisphere. The Russians are saying you can't move an alliance, which was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union, right up to our border. And we, on the other hand, refuse to accept that line of argument, and we continue to insist insist that Ukraine will become part of NATO. And as long as we continue to insist that, the Russians are going to push back. And by the way, in the process, they're going to wreck Ukraine as a functioning country. And furthermore, they're going to cause huge schisms over time inside NATO, because increasing numbers of people are going to come to realize that the Russian position is a reasonable position. Reasonable position.
Well, but Professor Mearsheimer, I have to say, first of all, in 2008, at the Bucharest Bush administration for the beginning of a membership application process for Ukraine and Georgia, this was blocked by European NATO members and it was reduced to the so-called MAP status. Since then, Russia has been given informal assurances by the United States that no NATO enlargement towards Ukraine is in the offing, and this has been confirmed by a number of NATO states. There is no desire for a Ukraine membership. Since then, as you pointed out in your presentation, in 2014, Russia invaded and annexed a part of Ukraine, Crimea, and destabilized permanently Donetsk and Luhansk, two large regions of Ukraine. In contradiction with international law, this is not how we resolve issues. So how can you say that this is entirely on NATO? It would seem that NATO, with its frankly pitiful military frontline defenses, can't really play the role that you're assigning to them.
Well, I would make a number of points. First of all, NATO has never said that Ukraine will not become part of NATO. The declaration that was made after the Bucharest summit remains in place. And if you want to solve this problem, take that declaration off the table. Second, you are absolutely correct that the Europeans, the Germans and the French in particular, were opposed to any movement at Bucharest to bringing Ukraine into NATO, because the Europeans understood full well what the consequences would be. And what we're now seeing are those consequences. If the Europeans had prevailed instead of the foolish Americans, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in today. But of course, what's happened over time is the Americans have coerced the West Europeans into agreeing with them that the Russians are the bad guys and NATO is the good guys. With regard to what happened in 2014, as you surely know, the United States helped foster a coup in Ukraine that brought into power a pro-American leader and overthrew in Ukraine a pro-Russian leader. This scared the Russians greatly, because it's not just NATO expansion that worries the Russians, it's also EU expansion, and it's also the color revolutions, the movement to turn Ukraine into a pro-American liberal democracy, and then ultimately spread that color revolution into Russia. This scared the Russians, as it would scare any country that was in a situation like this. Basically, what's going on here is that American policy is to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. This is not acceptable to the Russians. The fact that people in the West have such difficulty understanding this boggles my mind. It's just common sense. All you have to do is look at how the United States has behaved over time with regard to the Monroe Doctrine to understand that the Russians are not going to tolerate Ukraine becoming a part of NATO.
But Professor Mearsheimer and Dr. Wertheim, I'm sorry, I just want to, but your argument seems to be premised on the United States not having the faintest idea about Ukraine. Ukraine is not a fully Western country. It's in the middle between a Russian reality and a Western reality, and this differs greatly from various parts of the country. The idea that Ukraine could become a card-carrying member of the West is madness. I've been to the country a great many times.
It is madness, but American foreign policy has been basically madness since the end of the Cold War. Steve and I basically agree on that point. The fact is, as you point out, from 1991 to 2013, Ukraine was basically a neutral state, caught between NATO on one side and Russia on the other. But our goal was to change that situation. Our goal was to integrate Ukraine into the West in the same way we attempted to integrate Poland, the Czech Republic, and all sorts of other Eastern European countries into the West. This is what liberal hegemony was all about in the unipolar moment. And that's why I said in my formal presentation that what you see happening today is a vestige of the unipolar moment. The United States, when it expanded eastward with NATO expansion and pushing EU expansion and the color revolutions, did not do that because it saw Russia as a threat. Until February 2014, we did not see Russia as a threat. But after the crisis broke out in 2014, we couldn't blame ourselves. We couldn't blame the West. We couldn't blame NATO expansion. We had to create a new story that made the Russians the bad guys and us the good guys. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Russians became this highly expansionist great power, bent on dominating Eastern Europe, bent on recreating the Russian Empire or the former Soviet Union. But we were not thinking that way before February 2014. Our basic goal was to turn Ukraine into basically a pro-Western liberal democracy, to integrate it into the zone of peace. Of course, it backfired because we didn't listen to the Russians and what their concerns were after the April 2008 Bucharest summit.
Ok, skal jeg si det en gang til? Stephen Wertheim, would you agree with Professor Mearsheimer's views regarding American faults and delusions regarding its policies towards Ukraine and more broadly that of NATO?
Largely, yes. A couple nitpicks, but let me stipulate that it could well be that Putin simply wants Ukraine at this point. It could be that the diplomatic effort is unserious. I think that is distinctly possible. But even if that does prove to be true, there was still a history leading up to this point. After all, Putin has been in power for a long time, and we have not seen him threaten Ukraine in this way for several decades. And I think it should be understandable why a great power would not want a foreign military alliance that historically has been aimed at Moscow to expand up to its borders, and in particular to expand to a country with the strategic, cultural, and historical significance to Russia of Ukraine. That doesn't make it right, obviously, what Russia is doing. It is aggression. It would violate, if Russia further commits aggression, the UN Charter yet again. But we have to understand in international politics how the world works. And I think if the United States faced a similar threat of a foreign power expanding a military alliance and trying to, even flirting with extending that alliance to Mexico, the United States would act potentially quite aggressively as well. Now, I don't think we have to assume, however, that Putin is mainly concerned with the near-term prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. It ought to be clear to him. I can't say what he's thinking, and I'm kind of tired with people speculating as to what Vladimir Putin may be thinking. But it wouldn't make much sense if Putin did not appreciate that Ukraine, despite the 2008 Bucharest Pledge, has not received a membership action plan, which would put it potentially on a path to join NATO. But he could nevertheless fear, given the continued flirtation with potential Ukrainian membership in NATO, that Ukraine eventually might become a part of NATO, or at least is on a track to become more and more aligned with the West. And Putin may look to his historical legacy and see that he's presided over several rounds of NATO expansion. Under his watch, Ukraine has become more Western oriented, and his own gamble in 2014 has so far backfired by backing separatists in the easternmost part of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin did not get the foothold into Ukrainian politics that he was hoping for. And instead, Ukraine has increasingly sought more of a strategic alignment with the West. So I think we should be able to understand this, even if I can't say that this is exactly what Vladimir Putin might be after in this particular instance. Now, Asle, you asked about whether NATO could provide clarity about this matter. I don't think that there's a real chance that NATO could do what Russia has formally demanded and permanently close its open door. But NATO members could try to meet Russia halfway and make clear what is actually the case, which is that they do not support Ukraine joining NATO for the foreseeable future. They do not wish to extend a membership action plan to Ukraine. And obviously, each member of the NATO alliance has a veto power over whether a new member will join. And perhaps a coordinated effort, which we've seen signs of already in Washington and in Paris, might provide some reassurance for Russia.
Thank you for that. That most of the stuff that that one could ask for is already happened. Russia has been given underhanded signals that Ukraine is not going to join the alliance. The alliance is militarily weak and not really capable of threatening anyone. Frontline defenses have been neglected. I have to ask, is this because of a perception in the Kremlin regarding the strength of the current American presidential administration? Are they trying it on with Biden, do you think?
Shall I take that?
Why don't you go first, Steve, and then I'll go after you.
Yes, please, Stephen.
Sounds great. I think Biden's presidency might have something to do with Russia's gambit right now, but it's not so much because I think the Kremlin perceives Biden as weak in the aftermath of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but something almost like the opposite. If again the Kremlin is thinking in somewhat rational terms, I think they would see Joe Biden as a rather shrewd and pragmatic kind of a realist. It should show that his willingness to withdraw from Afghanistan indicates that Biden is hoping to make strategic adjustments and refocus the United States on the biggest challenge. Mean weakness. And hopefully, if I'm right about this, the Kremlin would not assume that Biden would not wish to defend NATO allies that the United States is formally committed to defend. But it could well be, and it would make sense if Vladimir Putin took a measure of Joe Biden and understood that the president was not going to do something so reckless and out of proportion with American interests as to actually fight a great power war with Russia over Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO. And if that was the calculation, I think that calculation would be correct. But this shouldn't be a kind of condemnation of Joe Biden. I think this is more of a condemnation of the expansionist American grand strategy that led us to the point where the United States was flirting semi-seriously with NATO membership for Ukraine, which I think inevitably was going to cause the kind of confrontation that we're seeing now.
Yeah, let me say a few words in the wake of what Stephen said. First of all, Asle, NATO has never said that Ukraine will not become a member of the alliance. This is a black and white issue. Either you say that or you don't say that. To say that it's not going to happen for a while, it might not ever happen, is not satisfactory to the Russians. The Russians are making it perfectly clear that we have to say that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And that has not been said. And you're implying that it has been said. It has not been said. This is a very black and white issue. The second point is Ukraine is in the process of becoming a de facto member of NATO. We are arming the Ukrainians. We are training the Ukrainians. We have close diplomatic relations with the Ukrainians. We emphasize that we care greatly about their security, even if we won't fight for them. We talk about them in the context of our allies and partners. The rhetoric is used all the time. If you're on the Russian side and you see the Ukrainians being armed, you see the Ukrainians being trained by NATO forces, you see NATO leaders talking about Ukraine as if it were a de facto member of the alliance, you don't think this is going to really upset the Russians? You've been studying great power politics for a long time. You know how great powers behave. They're paranoid about their security. They intensely dislike the idea of another great power with its military alliance marching up to its border. So again, we have not said that NATO will not eventually bring Ukraine into the alliance, and we are now in the process of making it a de facto member of the alliance. And this is a prescription for disaster. Now you say, maybe this is due to the fact that Joe Biden is weak. This crisis has been on the front burner for a long time. It started in February 2014, and Joe Biden was not the president. Barack Obama was the president, right? The crisis has gone on since then, right, to include the period when Donald Trump was president, and it continues today. And it is going to go on and on as long as we refuse to say some very simple words. Ukraine will not become part of NATO. Ukraine will not become.
But I have to ask you both then, how is this different from Munich? How is this different from, I guess that was 1938, when the British tried to buy peace in Europe by agreeing to a small East European country being dismembered by a great power, claiming security interests? And how would it be possible in order for the West to make such a statement without seeming to underwrite the partitioning and devouring of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, which I'm sure the Western powers will not be willing to do, because it would mean that we are no longer subscribing to the core tenet of the international order.
This bears no resemblance to Munich. The idea that Vladimir Putin is the second coming of Adolf Hitler and that Russia today is the second coming of Nazi Germany is simply not a serious argument. Furthermore, nobody is talking about dismembering Ukraine the way Czechoslovakia was dismembered in October 1938 at Munich. That is not what is happening here. What we're talking about is effectively moving away from an effort on the part of the United States and its allies to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark. And if you're looking for an analogy here, the analogy is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets tried to put military forces in Cuba. It enraged the United States. And if you look at our relations with Cuba today, we still have sanctions on Cuba. We still have our gun sights on Cuba. Why? Because the thought that those Cubans would invite a distant great power into the Western Hemisphere bothered us so greatly then that it has continued to this day. That's the basic situation that you have in Eastern Europe today. The Russians don't want Ukraine to become a member of NATO in the same way that the United States did not want Cuba to become an ally of the Soviet Union armed with nuclear-tipped missiles from the Soviet Union. But this has no parallel whatsoever with Munich in 1938.
Sure,
Dr.
and if I
Wertheim,
could just...
do you think that there are any parallels, or do you subscribe to the Cuban Missile Crisis analogy?
Oh, I think that's a useful analogy. I think another one could be Austrian neutrality in the Cold War, a way of preserving Austria's sovereignty and independence, not undermining it, not undermining any important international rules. The whole point of a diplomatic agreement between the West and Russia would be to preserve the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine in what may well be the only practical way it can be preserved. And there would be no tolerance whatsoever of aggression against Ukraine. Not incorporating a country into a particular military alliance, that is not a violation of any international rules and norms. And I think there's a bit of inflation, rhetorical inflation about the rules when I see members of the Biden administration or other leaders talk about a sacrosanct right of countries to join whatever security arrangements they desire. There is a right to apply, but the right goes only that far. There is no obligation by NATO to admit any other country. It would be absurd if that were to happen. NATO would collapse because a whole slew of countries would seek to join. They would automatically be admitted, and no one would believe that the Article 5 guarantee would be credible. So this is obviously not a way to run international politics.
Professor Mearsheimer and Dr. Wertheim, from a European perspective, I'm I'm sure many of us have been wrong-footed by the depth and animosity of the emerging crisis over Ukraine. But it plays into a different aspect that is difficult for us to comprehend, and which I hope that you can help us shed some light on. And that is the current divisions in the United States over foreign policy. You see, in Europe, we have grown accustomed to the United States being a country where you can quarrel about pretty much anything, but you stand shoulder to shoulder over the broad tenets of American foreign policy. That does not seem to be the case anymore. So can you please lay out your views on what characterizes the core camps, the big camps in terms of American foreign policy right now?
Steve, do you want to go first?
Sure. But come right in after me and tell me where I'm wrong. Right now, I think what we're not seeing, first of all, is the resurgence of isolationism. I don't see that. Donald Trump was called an isolationist, but Donald Trump's most enduring foreign policy legacy might well be to lead the charge in a new Cold War with China. That doesn't sound like any kind of isolationism, even a caricatured kind that we can think of from the history of the 20th century. What I think we are seeing, though, are sort of two coherent demands emerging that take account of the demise of the unipolar moment. One of them is an orientation toward great power competition, with China far and away being the more significant competitor than Russia. In fact, perhaps that position has even morphed into a more determined desire to contain or counterbalance Chinese power in the Asia Pacific. And you can see that trend, beginning with the Obama administration announcing a pivot to Asia a decade ago. But then there's also something else brewing, which is a demand for restraint more or less across the board. And that doesn't mean pulling all U.S. forces home from outside the Western Hemisphere, but it does mean taking account of what America's priorities truly are at this point in the 21st century. Internationally, it might mean focusing on climate change. We can add to that pandemic disease, which are threats that arguably affect the American people more than the conventional threats of even the Chinese military. And most of all is a demand by the American public, a very discontented American public, to take care of problems at home, including crumbling infrastructure and a quite acute crisis in American governance, with ever increasing animosity and polarization between the parties. And at a minimum, this is a hugely absorbing task for any president of the United States to deal with. And so that's part of the reason why these two trends, they can coexist together for some time. I mean, they converged around in Afghanistan. Ending the war in Afghanistan is good if your goal is great power competition. It's good if your goal is restraint internationally and more of a domestic focus. At some point, we'll see more of a frontal divergence between those two positions. But as I said in my opening remarks, we see inertia reigning in America's overall global position. And so the demand both for focus on China and for restraint and domestic priorities, those remain compelling.
I don't think, Asle, that there is any meaningful difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, except on one issue. For me, the Republicans and the Democrats are like Tweedledee and Tweedledum when it comes to American foreign policy. Now, why do I say that? I think there are three areas of the world that matter to the Biden administration and mattered to the Trump administration before that. One is East Asia, and there we're talking about the China threat. Two is Europe, and there we're talking about the Russia threat. And three is the greater Middle East, especially Iran. With regard to China, there's no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on China, which is the most important foreign policy issue for the United States. In fact, Joe Biden is following in the footsteps of Donald Trump. Whether you think that's good or bad is another matter, but he is following in Trump's footsteps. And the Republicans are hardly criticizing him on China. With regard to Russia, I don't see any meaningful difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on Russia. So in two of the three areas that really matter, you see Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That brings us to the greater Middle East. Not much difference on Afghanistan. Biden got criticized for how he handled it, but in terms of getting out, I think the Republicans and the Democrats basically believed it was the right thing to do. And there were a sprinkling of Republicans and a sprinkling of Democrats who disagreed. With regard to Israel, there's no daylight between the Democrats and the Republicans. The one issue where there's daylight is Iran. There's no daylight on the sense that both the Republicans and the Democrats want to make sure that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons. But the question is, how do you think about the JCPOA, the agreement consummated in 2015 between Iran and the United States and some European allies and the Russians and the Chinese that Trump pulled out of, right? Should we get back in or not? The Democrats, and here we're talking about the Biden administration, of course, the Democrats want to get back into the JCPOA. And if they do, the Republicans will go to great lengths to crucify them for doing that. So with regard to the JCPOA, the specifics of how to deal with Iran, there is, I believe, a real divide between the Republicans and the Democrats. But that's the only issue I see where there's any meaningful difference between the two parties.
Following up on that, would you like to comment a little bit about the current quality of American foreign policy leadership? Because over the years that have passed since the end of World War II, the West have come to rely on American statesmanship and an American vision for international politics, garnered by a willingness to spend kind words and cruise missiles and everything in between in order to uphold this order. The shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan and a region and a country where Western leaders for the longest time had said the future of NATO would be determined in Afghanistan. Well, let's not hope so. Currently, we just saw on the Norwegian television that one of your senators, say Roger Wicker out of Mississippi, seemed to argue that the Americans should plunk down the US Navy somewhere in the Black Sea and rain hell and fury down on the Russians, including first-use nuclear weapons. And one have to ask, what do you think about the quality of the American leadership right now? Are they up to the task? Because the way that you have described it, the United States is in one of the greatest shifts in American foreign policy for over 50 years. And this is not a shift of your own choosing, it's a shift of polarity, it's a shift of power. Are the Americans up to the task? And if anything, what should the Europeans do in order to aid their ally?
I'll start this time, okay, Steve, and then you can come in behind me. Let's take it back to the end of the Cold War. I think that starting in the early 1990s up until 2017, American foreign policy was clearly bankrupt. And I think the best evidence of that was that Donald Trump, when he ran for president, defeated all of his Republican rivals by arguing that Republican foreign policy, especially under George W. Bush, had been bankrupt. And then in the general election, he ran against Hillary Clinton, and he said American foreign policy, as it applied to Democratic leadership during the unipolar moment, had been bankrupt. Donald Trump won the election. He won the election in part by running on the platform that American foreign policy during the unipolar moment was bankrupt. That brings us to Donald Trump's tenure in the White House. I find it hard to believe that there would be many people in Europe who would argue that that was solid or sound leadership. I certainly wouldn't argue that. So that brings us to Joe Biden. If you look at what Joe Biden has done, right, since taking office, it doesn't look too promising. I believe that he has made a mess with regard to Russia and the Ukraine crisis. I'm sure that most Europeans disagree with that, but I think he's made a mess of this and we have no exit. And with regard to Iran, he promised to get right back into the JCPOA, and he failed to do that. And I'm not sure we're going to get back into the JCPOA. And if we don't get back into the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear issue remains a really difficult problem for us to deal with. So I'll give Biden the benefit of the doubt because he's only been in office for 1 year. But I'll just say it doesn't look too good. But if you look before Biden, you see Trump. And if you look before Trump, you see a handful of presidents who Trump was able to defeat by, whose policies Trump was able to defeat by arguing that they were bankrupt. So American leadership does not look very good. But if you look at the Europeans, it seems to me they drank the Kool-Aid and they bought into all of these crazy policies that the Americans were pursuing during the post-Cold War period. The Europeans bought into NATO expansion. The Europeans went along with the Americans, even after protesting at Bucharest, with the idea that we should extend NATO's borders to include Ukraine and Georgia. So the Europeans are part of the problem. The Europeans hardly ever stand up to the United States. Even when you're talking to Europeans in private and they think that what the Americans are doing is foolish, they don't speak up to the Americans. They prefer to follow the Americans. The end result is we're in a whole heck of a lot of trouble in Eastern Europe today. But of course, we're blaming that on Vladimir Putin. We'd never blame it on ourselves. It can't be America's fault. It can't be NATO's fault because we're the good guys. We do everything right all the time. They're the bad guys.
So I'll underscore the point, first of all, don't overestimate the past competence of U.S. foreign policy. The United States had an easy hand to play coming out of the Cold War. It could make mistakes that weren't very costly for Americans or for the overall international order. The United States still made very costly mistakes that did damage, whether you're a liberal internationalist or a realist. And so here we are. Now, with respect to the Afghanistan withdrawal, unfortunately, you don't get to lose a war, especially to the Taliban, and expect the result to look like you've won it, to look pleasant. That's not how things work. Now, the Biden administration could have done some things better, especially to process special immigrant visas as soon as it had any idea that it might withdraw. But fundamentally, there was going to be no happy ending to a 20-year-long war lost to the Taliban. The lesson of Afghanistan, therefore, should not be that suddenly American leaders are incompetent, Biden doesn't know what he's doing, but rather that the 2 decades of his bipartisan predecessors put him in this position, made big mistakes, and he faced a difficult but correct choice to withdraw. But take a step back for a minute. It would be a risky thing for international peace and stability, to stake everything on the competence and farsightedness of one country, one country's foreign policy elite, and one president. To me, that's the warning that Trump's presidency should bring to the fore. The United States set out to be the indispensable nation in the 1990s. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright claimed that the reason the United States was indispensable was that we see farther into the future than other countries do. I've always thought that good leadership was about making yourself as dispensable as possible so that other people can do things for themselves.
Well, that is agreed, but if I may, just for a moment here, take the Europeans' point of view. Over the past 70 years, Europe has developed, let's call it a defense dependence culture. We have been trained to look to the United States for geopolitical leadership. Our armies and air forces and navies make little sense without the diminishing factor of the Americans. NATO without the United States is not a military alliance. It would be more akin to a suicide pact. The Europeans are not able to shoulder European security in the military sense at the current time. And when the United States asked under President Biden for NATO to come on board in criticizing China, effectively leveling NATO as a chess piece, at least, I wouldn't say a pawn, but maybe a tower or something like that, in its geopolitical game against China, NATO seemed to be willing, the Europeans seemed to be willing to play that role. Isn't there something to be said for keeping the West united? Because what I hear from the two of you is that the Europeans should be able to deal with the Russians on their own, and the United States should get on with the task at hand, which is balancing China. Am I wrong?
I'll quickly jump in. I think there's no question that from Europe's point of view, it makes sense to have the Americans present in Europe. NATO is a net positive for Europe. The United States serves as a pacifier. There's no question about that. So you have a vested interest in keeping us in Europe. And this, of course, is why I have never once heard a European leader say that the United States should leave Europe or that NATO should disintegrate. Instead, European leaders worry that we will leave Europe and they will be left on their own. So I fully understand that it's in your interest as a European to have the Americans there. The question is whether or not it's in our interest. Now, I think when you look at the domestic political problems that we have at home, it is imperative that we focus much more attention and many more resources on solving our problems at home. Because if we're not careful, we're not going to be a liberal democracy much longer. You do not want to underestimate how much trouble we are in at home. And when you're running all over the world trying to solve everybody else's problems, this is going to detract in good part from fixing problems at home. So that's the first reason I've long been in favor of getting America out of Europe militarily. The second point I would make to you is that we face a peer competitor. You do not want to underestimate the fact that the United States pursued a foolish policy of engagement toward China during the unipolar moment. And in the process, we created a peer competitor. This is one of the greatest strategic blunders of all time. The United States of America helped to create a peer competitor. But that's where we are today. We have a peer competitor in Asia, China, We have no peer competitor in Europe. Therefore, we need to focus laser-like on on East Asia, and we need to pivot out of Europe. The only argument one can make for keeping American forces in Europe, in my opinion, is that we, in effect, work out an arrangement with the Europeans where we continue to serve as the pacifier, and in return, they agree to continue to work with us to contain China. But absent that, I would be in favor of pulling all American troops out of Europe as soon as possible.
Yeah, let me just add to that. We have to ask why Europe is as dependent strategically as Asle suggests. Could it be that Europeans who seem so skilled at providing good lives for their citizens, at building democracies that look more durable than America's own right now, really incapable of organizing a defense? I think not. I think the issue is incentives as well as a weight of history and not understandably not wanting to go back to a more militarized Europe. The United States continues to complain about burden sharing, but then to do the thing that prevents burden sharing, which would be drawing down its forces in Europe and making the kind of strategic adjustments that John was talking about. In that respect, Donald Trump was simply a nastier version of the same. And basically every administration since the creation of NATO has sought to have Europeans do more in defense, but was unwilling to have the United States take a serious step back from European defense. And I know it could feel like the status quo has gone on forever. There are risks, of course, for more autonomy in European defense. And can't things continue? After all, yes, Europe is not right now up to the job in terms of its force posture and you name it, everything else to handle European defense. But what I was warning about in my initial remarks is that the discrepancy between U.S. interests and the costs and risks that continuing to be the leading agent in European security will pose, that discrepancy is getting greater in a way that hasn't existed in the past many decades. And when that discrepancy opens up, in fact, what we get is an unstable situation and perhaps a deterrent that no longer becomes credible.
But what would you then say to those who would argue that you are getting this wrong, that what you treat as two separate complexes, Russia and China, are in fact one, and that the goal of the Trump administration and every administration before it to make sure that there is a wedge between Russia and China, well, it seems now that the wedge has slipped. Putin hightailed off to Beijing amidst the Ukrainian crisis and seemed, at least on the face of it, to return with promises of fealty bordering on a strategic alliance between Beijing and Moscow. And wouldn't you then say that the challenge facing the United States in East Asia is intimately connected to the challenge facing Europe in Donetsk and Luhansk currently? And isn't it possible that should the Russians throw caution to the wind and actually assault and occupy parts of Ukraine, wouldn't this potentially be, and you alluded to this in your opening remarks, Dr. Wertheim, wouldn't this encourage China to make a play for Taiwan?
Stephen, why don't you go ahead, since Asle directed his last comments to you, and then I'll come in after you.
Sounds good. I think that U.S. policy has been part of the reason why Russia and China have come together as they have. It was far from obvious that so close a strategic alignment would come to pass, given all the things that Russia and China have to worry about in their own relationship. So this is, in a sense, precisely what I worry about. If the likely outcome of the standoff over Ukraine is increasing isolation of Russia from Europe, which may well be justified depending on Russia's behavior, that will make Russia only more dependent on China and solidify the bonds between China and Russia. We're already seeing those signs, as you mentioned, Asle. And if at all possible, it would be highly desirable to avoid that situation. Now, you can't just do a quote unquote reverse Kissinger and change the deep factors that have caused Russia and China to come more into alignment. Their factors are economic as well and ideological. But what we can do is create serious incentives for those countries to come more closely into alignment with China as the senior partner. And over time, that restricts our options and helps to create the very thing that U.S. grand strategy in World War II was trying to avoid, which was a hostile alliance of powers that could dominate Eurasia. With respect to the Taiwan question, I think that this is really a specter being raised for political purposes. I think it would be very unlikely for events in Ukraine to change the calculus in Beijing over Taiwan. China has a reason to think that its current trajectory can achieve its goal eventually of peaceful reunification. But under one scenario, perhaps it might change the calculus in Beijing. And that is if the United States were to get seriously involved in a war with Russia in Ukraine. That would tie up American resources and attention, providing a window of opportunity, perhaps, as Beijing might see it. And it would also signal something else. It would show that the United States exceeded the bounds of its defense perimeter. That even though the United States had not, in fact, supported Ukraine's membership in NATO in a serious way, as opposed to rhetoric, that even though Ukraine had not previously lain within the U.S. defense perimeter, the United States fought for it anyway. I think it's quite possible that if you're observing those events in Beijing, you become more concerned that, in fact, the United States will fight for Taiwan, even though the United States formally adheres to the one China policy and the principle of strategic ambiguity vis-a-vis its commitment to defend Taiwan. And therefore, you might fear it's now or never, and better to go now if the United States is actually involved in a war with Russia. I don't think that's going to happen, but if you're really concerned about China invading Taiwan in the near term, which I'm not terribly concerned about, you should be more concerned with the United States getting heavily involved in Ukraine than the reverse.
Let me make a couple points. Asle, you started by making the argument that Russia and China are inextricably linked in a geopolitical sense. And I think you're absolutely right. There's no question about that. And the Americans think that way. But the point I made in my formal remarks, and I want to reiterate here, is that because of NATO expansion and because of our refusal to deal with that issue in a way that is satisfactory to the Russians, we are exacerbating the situation that the West has with Russia, and we are driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This is a remarkably foolish way of doing business. Stephen was alluding to World War II. In World War II, the United States had to decide whether it was going to ally with Germany against the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union, or with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. There's no way the United States could fight against both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union at the same time. So we formed a marriage of convenience with the Soviet Union, which was certainly the smart thing to do, and we defeated Nazi Germany. And it wasn't because we liked the Soviet Union, it was because the strategic imperatives of the situation said form an alliance with one of the two, and obviously the one you wanted to ally with was the Soviet Union. If you look at the situation today, the United States is facing two other great powers in the world, Russia and China. Which is the greater threat to the United States? China, okay? Therefore, the United States should have good relations with the Russians, but we don't. And indeed, what we're doing is pushing them into the arms of the Chinese. Why? Because of NATO expansion. Now, you say that Russia is this great threat and that we really have to worry about it. I do not believe that Russia is a great threat. It's NATO expansion that has spooked the Russians. The Russians, I believe, have no interest in conquering Ukraine. As I wrote in 2014 in Foreign Affairs, it would be like swallowing a porcupine. The Russians have had experience trying to occupy other countries like Afghanistan. They occupied huge chunks of Eastern Europe. They've been there, done that, and it did not work out very well. They would be remarkably foolish to occupy Ukraine. It would do them great damage. But let's assume they do it anyway. So what? Ukraine is not strategically important enough for the United States or any European country to say that it will defend Ukraine. We have said we're not going to defend Ukraine. The Europeans have said they're not going to defend Ukraine. What they're saying is it is strategically not so important that we should fight and die for it. So if the Russians try to swallow this porcupine, which will be an experiment that will not go very well, it's not going to matter strategically to us. What matters strategically to the United States is China. Now, what about Taiwan? I think I have a somewhat different view than Stephen on this. I think the United States has to be very careful not to look weak vis-a-vis the Russians over NATO expansion. This is the mess that we've really gotten ourselves into. If we're to back off, right, and not get some sort of quid pro quo from the Russians, we're going to look weak. And I think the Chinese will be paying very careful attention. If the United States pulls out of Afghanistan after 20 years in a war that really doesn't matter very much, China's not going to take that as a signal that the United States has lost its nerve. But if we were to cave quickly and completely to the Russians, that would cause us potential trouble in Taiwan. As you pointed out, Asle, at the beginning, these two issues are linked. This is why I think the best solution to the Ukraine crisis is to turn it into a neutral state. Because if you turn Ukraine into a neutral state, we give up on NATO expansion into Ukraine. That's the concession we make. And the Russians concede, they make a concession that Ukraine will not remain or in the Russian orbit, or the Russians will not try to keep or put Ukraine in their orbit. It will be a neutral state. So they will be making a concession as well. So I think we have to be really careful here how we handle this whole subject of Russia and NATO expansion into Ukraine, because I do think it has implications for the U.S. commitment to Taiwan.
Thank you, Professor Mearsheimer. I was rereading one of the not so much read tracts of international politics, which is the diaries of Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. And one of the issues that he keeps returning to when he gets the losses that they suffer in Ukraine from partisan activities, and he has this comment where he says, it would appear that a blow to the head is not always the best argument, or basically saying that the worse they treated the civilian population, the worse it got for the Germans, and it made their situation untenable. And I would agree with you that that an attempt to occupy Ukraine probably would be a very painful endeavor for Russia. That being said, the Russians do seem to have a doctrine that if force hasn't achieved the objectives, you just haven't used enough force. They are willing to go much further than we in the West are in that kind of similar situations. But I wanted to take a step a little bit to the side here and ask you about the future of American power, because for the longest time, and I would like to encourage the audience to read both of your greatest hits. You know, for Professor Mearsheimer, you will never escape the shadow of the tragedy of great power politics, which is on curricula all over the world, but also Dr. Wertheim's And Tomorrow the World. Both of them are succinct analysis of the underpinnings of American foreign policy. And I would like for both of you to comment a little bit about how you see the United States moving ahead, because yes, we get it. We get it. You agree that China is the #1 threat. We get it. Russia is a sideshow, which should be put to rest, preferably not in a humiliating manner. Yes, sure. But at the current time, and it might just be some intellectual deficiency on my part, but it does seem that America hasn't quite made up its mind about what strategy you're going to be pursuing against the Chinese. It seems to be part engagement, part attempts at balancing or at containing the Chinese. You seem to be in two minds about whether you want Russia as a de facto ally, or whether you will have to fight them on the steppes of Ukraine. Where do we see America moving from here? This is a question of great interest for all the European allies, who most of us have, like Norway, been very loyal to the United States for a great many years. And we're a little bit concerned about where we fit in when it comes to the future of American geopolitics.
You want me to start, Stephen, on this one? Okay, I'll go first, and Stephen can come after me. My bottom line in Tragedy of Great Power Politics is that the two principal goals for any great power are to, #1, be a regional hegemon, to dominate your area of the world, and #2, to make sure that no other country dominates its region of the world. And the United States, from 1783, when it got its independence, up until roughly 1900, went to enormous lengths to become a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And I would argue that by about 1900, we had established that first goal. We were a regional hegemon. And by the way, the only regional hegemon in the history of the modern world. Second, in the 20th century, we faced 4 countries that threatened to become regional hegemons, either in Europe or Asia or Eurasia. Those 4 potential regional hegemons were Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries on the scrap heap of history. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. It goes to great lengths to wreck them. Because again, the principal message of tragedy is that you want to be a regional hegemon and you don't want a peer competitor. Well, the United States today, because of the foolish policy of engagement during the unipolar moment, has helped create a peer competitor, a country that threatens to dominate all of Asia. The Chinese, in my humble opinion, are committed to becoming a regional hegemon. I don't blame them one bit. If I was playing China's hand, I'd want to dominate all of Asia, just as I, as an American, want to dominate the Western Hemisphere. But of course, the United States is deeply committed to preventing that from happening. Now, what happened when Donald Trump became the president in January of 2017 is he abandoned the policy of engagement and he adopted a policy of containment. The fact is, we had a radical shift in our policy towards China under President Trump. Whatever you think of President Trump, I believe that he was correct in making that switch. President Trump is no longer in the White House. President Biden, who was an arch proponent of engagement when he was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and when he was the vice president, is now the president. You might have expected President Biden to go back to engagement, to move away from Trump's policy of containment. But in fact, what has happened is that President Biden has followed in the footsteps of President Trump. The United States is now containing China. Engagement is kaput. The problem, and this is what I think you were getting at, Asle, the problem is that the United States has been paying limited attention to China because it's so busy in Europe with the Ukraine problem, and it's so busy in the Persian Gulf with the Iran problem that it hasn't been able to really focus on China and figure out exactly how it plans to contain China. So you actually hear lots of our Asian allies asking us, what is the game plan? What exactly is the strategy for containing China? And we do not have a good answer. And we do not have a good answer because we are overextended. We are busy fighting in other places on the planet. What we have to do is focus laser-like on China and come up with a strategy for dealing with China.
Well, you've heard that John has an admirably clear thesis. Sorry. I was just about to say that John has an admirably clear thesis about where the United States is going, and that's a Cold War with China. He could well be right, but I'm a historian, and I'm not sure. I see a great deal of flux right now in U.S. foreign policy. And, I think still, if you think about what was so problematic to the United States about the Axis powers and about Soviet-backed communism that caused the United States to depart from its historic tradition and counteract those threats, it didn't just involve the agglomeration of significant power in Eurasia. It also involved the totalitarian nature of those powers that created, through their conquests, what Americans called a closed world. And coming out of World War II, what Americans said they wanted was an open world. And that, by the way, could even have involved spheres of influence, as long as they were not exclusively under the control of one power. So despite the radical shift in China policy that has occurred under the Trump administration, I'm just not so sure the Cold War is a done deal. Goldman Sachs doesn't seem to think the Cold War is a good deal. Trade in goods and finance remains high. And I even read the Biden administration as being more ambivalent than one might think. It does seek to cooperate with China on climate change. And if one hears some of the so-called China hawks in the administration talk about the problem, they emphasize what I think John would find a rather muddled mix of a desire for competition and cooperation. The cooperation element remains significant. So as of now, even though I've previously warned about the onset of a Cold War between the United States and China, perhaps what we're seeing is a performative Cold War where the rhetoric has gotten out in front of the reality. Maybe that will harden and the performative word should be removed, but maybe not. But John, I think, got it right. U.S. overextension could well continue, and that also could prevent a more disciplined focus on China from really setting in.
Stephen and John, thank you so much for taking your time to elucidate these questions for us. I believe that our brief session has been a testament to why one should listen to scholars and not necessarily always journalists. I do believe for any casual news reader or watcher, our discussions about complex topics such as Afghanistan, the Ukraine, American geopolitics and the relationship to China, all of these issues have become a little bit more clear, looking into it from perhaps a greater distance, and also taking on board the key interests of the United States and of the Alliance. This has been a seminar from the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, and I would like to thank you all for watching. And you will find other contributions from the Norwegian Atlantic Committee on YouTube and other social media channels. Thank you so much.